Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Today, I'm joined by guest Marco Campana to talk about immigration. Marco, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
For listeners who are hearing you for the first time, can you share a bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. So I am a freelance, communications consultant. I work with immigrant and refugee serving organizations in Canada, focused really on helping them harness technology in their service delivery, and really sort of looking at digital transformation and figuring out how they can use technology to connect with their clients and provide direct services to them through a hybrid approach, I guess is what we would be calling it now, the idea of some in person, some online, and being able to kind of move between those two channels with their clients based on the client's preference.
And I'm curious to know how you got started working in this space.
Yeah, great question. I'm very much what they call an accidental techie. I would say that, I come out with a political science degree, and I worked as a career practitioner certificate professionally. And I got exposed to technology, the internet, very early in my career because I had a really free, sort of forward-thinking executive director who got us connected to the internet way back in, screaming modem days, Windows 3.1 kind of thing. And so I've always seen it as a tool in our work. And then in the early 2000s, I was working on the settlement.org website, which is a site providing information around settlement for newcomers to Ontario specifically. And then I kind of flipped over to the practitioner side, where I was helping people understand how they could use technology in their work when I worked at OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. And so I always approached it as a tool, not as a techie, as saying, like, listen, these technology tools exist. Newcomers are using them. We've always been able to show research that newcomers are more digitally literate and sort of digitally forward thinking in a lot of cases. Obviously, there's also digital divide issues, but certainly they were more digitally literate than agencies. And so there were missed opportunities in how we reached out and served to newcomers. So I started kind of proselytizing, if you will, technology and talking about it, not as a panacea, but as a tool, as another tool in your tool belt. Like, technology is not going to solve all your problems, but the more we use technology with people who want to use it, the more scale we could have, the more scope we could be making in our work, and we could really kind of help people who might not want or have time or have family situations or work situations in order to come into bricks and service kind of organizations to get their help. And so that sort of just kind of for the last 15 or 20 years has been part of my work. And then I sort of moved into consulting about 9 years ago, where I'm doing essentially similar work to what I was doing when I was with OCASI and other agencies, but it was a bit too soon back then. Not a lot of agencies, wanted to think about technology. So now people, especially during the pandemic, have realized that digital is a tool that can be used, and that a lot of newcomers, in fact, prefer to be served using technology. So we're really kind of on the cusp of a hybrid service delivery model, and I've been lucky enough to be part of that for many years. So I continue to kind of be in that space now.
Screaming modem, man, that brings me back. It's a great analogy. I don't know if I actually used those words before, but it definitely brings me back to those days.
If you heard it, you remember it, right?
Oh yeah, I love it. It's a nostalgic, I think, sound now at this point for me.
It is, yeah.
But I share your vision of, tools are a fantastic mechanism to help. Like any tool, I mean, it's designed to serve a purpose, and it can only serve you better. Like, I only want to see the positive side of things, at least, in that, with the right tools, you can accomplish many more things than you could without the tools, right?
Absolutely.
Cutting a tree down with your bare hands is kind of difficult, but with the right tool, it can be very easily done.
That's right. Yeah, and I think a lot of it kind of stems back to in social services and human service sectors is really kind of the roots of the work. When I was brought into the sector, we did a lot of learning and training about popular education techniques, where you start with the knowledge in the room, you start with the perspective and the knowledge that the people you're working with have. And when it comes to technology, we kind of sort of seem to forget that. So we're like, oh, I should be on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And we forget to go to our clients, in this case, newcomers, and say, well, how do you want to receive information from us? What are the tools that you're using, and how do you want to communicate? What are your preferences with us? And so I think that that's a big part of demystifying technology as well by calling it a tool and then saying you don't have to figure it out on your own. You talk to the people you're serving in the same way you would if you recognized, a number of moms from a certain ethnic group needed support. You'd start a moms group kind of thing because you have worked with them and you understand them. And so I think we sort of forget all of those lessons when we go online, when we think of technology. We forget to talk to the people who we're going to use it with.
I sometimes make the mistake of forgetting, because my world is a lot about tech. Sometimes I forget about certain industries and areas that really are, or used to be, let's say, afraid of tech. Lawyers, I can think of one thing, doctors and medicine. In your opinion, how is the immigration side of things? I mean, I imagine COVID has definitely accelerated, like every other industry, certain tools and technologies and whatnot. But so do you find like a lot of your part of what you do is educating them on why they should be using it before you actually are able to like sell them the idea?
Absolutely. And I mean, there has always been sort of traditionally a lot of pushback from agencies. I like to joke that up until the pandemic, I had the same sort of, 5 or 10 organizational examples that I would use in all my presentations of interesting and innovative technology use. And now that's expanded exponentially because the pandemic made everybody go digital and learn the lessons of what was good and negative and challenging and all of those sort of the full range of possibilities with technology. And so we are all in a place now where the people who kind of dug in their heels have realized technology definitely has a place, right? And the conversation has shifted now, not to should we be using technology, but how can we use it responsibly? How can we use it ethically? How can we use it in a client-centric way? So I think we have a lot of catching up to do in some ways with some sectors. But the nice thing is that there's a lot we can learn from those people. But for sure, the sector has had challenges around just understanding the possibilities of technology until we were kind of forced to use it.
And then if we were to give some examples of what kind of tools, do you have like certain systems, platforms, tools that you normally find work best for immigration purposes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really wide range. So, there's the idea. So in the immigration realm, I work in what we call the settlement, right? So the settlement of newcomers. And there's the pre-arrival, and then there's the post-arrival kind of services. So pre-arrival has always had a technology component because you're serving people overseas. And some of that is in person. There's examples where people are serving in person, but most of that is being done by technology. So you've had pre-arrival services around for about at least 10 years who are, using service portals. It could be, for example, Salesforce community, or it could be, something that's been built from scratch, or, even like a BuddyPress or a WordPress kind of installation. But then they're using things like WhatsApp, email, texting, Viber, Telegram, WeChat. They were quick adopters of using the technologies that their clients were using for communication back and forth. And then in the post-arrival, what we've always been doing is we formally call it a hybrid service model now, but people who are always using technology with their clients, even if they didn't think about it, right? So for example, you might do an intake and then you'll see the client face to face, and then you'll email them some materials based on that conversation, resources, links, an employment resume template or something like that. And people don't think about that as actually using technology because email is so banal. It's so we use it every day. But that is an example where you're using technology. And then people started to see that, okay, well, my client can't come in today, so maybe we could have a phone call, we could have a web chat, we could be on a video together. And so you started to see, people starting to use Skype and GoToMeeting and things like that. And now, of course, Zoom is Zoom and Teams are kind of the two standards when you see in our sector. So it comes from all the way from kind of like individual technologies, right? So I'll use WhatsApp, or I'll text my client, and then I'll have a video conference with them using Zoom. I'll email them some websites. We'll kind of go from there. And now what we have is, agencies who are creating apps, smartphone apps. We've got, full service portals behind the password where everything is done on the portal instead of in piecemeal technologies. And even the evolution of chatbots and more sort of automatic kinds of technology. So it's really been shifting over time, as well as things like from the administrative side, the creation and the use of CRMs and client portals to not only just sort of track what clients are doing, but also really, get some intelligence out of them and figure out from a data perspective what's the impact and outcome of our services? Where are the places we're not serving people and things like that? So it's really kind of become a wide range of technologies, and more we're seeing agencies predominantly using it in that more piecemeal approach. But we do have examples of agencies who have invested more in technology and have more of those kind of client portals. So, for example, I believe Access Employment in Toronto, which is an employment service provider that works not only with newcomers but with a lot of newcomers, they shifted to a digital intake process. So even if you go into their office, you'll tap away on a tablet or on a computer and create and do your own high-level intake. And I mean, I think it's helped resolve issues like typos in people's names and things like that because the person is putting it in themselves. But what was interesting is that automatically, based on some of the things you'll do in your intake, like identifying perhaps the sector you work in, the type of occupation you have, it auto enrolls people into some of their online learning. So the system talks to like a learning management system and says, okay, you've been enrolled in our 30-minute overview of job search, 30-minute overview of resume writing, introduction for job search for accountants, if that's what their background is, for example. And so immediately those people, even before they start to see a counselor or a worker, are starting to receive services, right? So it's that 24/7. And then they can interact with their service provider in person, online, and meander back and forth between those sort of channels based on their life situation or their preferences that day for that meeting, for example. So we've seen quite, versus a lot of organizations are still doing more manual intake. And then after that, maybe I'll WhatsApp you or I'll add you to my WhatsApp broadcast list, or we'll have a Zoom meeting. You can come in person. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing some organizations evolve into service platforms and others who are just using the tools because they don't have the infrastructure or the funding or the investment to create portals and platforms, but they're still using those tools in a similar way.
That's quite a few tools. You said Skype, it's cute. I'm curious to know whatever happened to Skype. It was in the leader at one point and now it's gone. Zoom, Teams has taken over.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It is. It's just one of the fascinating parts about being in technology and seeing the evolution of how certain technologies evolve and die or get repurposed. And then new ones come up and, bigger, better, stronger, faster, that just take over for X, Y, Z reason.
I think sometimes that creates overwhelm as well for people is, I've got to learn yet another tool, or I switch for certain reasons. So Skype, for example, I know of some organizations that switched from Skype because when Microsoft bought Skype, they changed some of the terms and conditions. It went from, full video encryption to no more encryption, and they were using it for service interactions. So they're paying attention to the terms and conditions, and then they switched to another video technology. Zoom almost had that happen to them early in the pandemic when they were making claims about encryption, but then researchers discovered they weren't. But what they did is they pivoted really quickly. They said we were committed to that, and within 90 days they were full end-to-end encryption. So you also start to see the up and comers are more nimble, more responsive to clients, for example, which is also really interesting. And I think that that happened, for example, to Microsoft, is that it became part of the behemoth in some ways, and probably the technology has been incorporated into Teams, and so instead of Skype now you have Teams. But that whole sort of constant change can be really overwhelming for people as well. When I've got a tool, the tool works well, now I have to change it. That has a huge impact sometimes on their whole service delivery, the competencies, the training, the confidence that someone might have in those systems. It can really upend things.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's one of the biggest challenges, if moving from one CRM, for example, to another, or even within the CRM, adding new functionality. They're used to doing things one way, and now they have to do it differently. It definitely falls into that change management perspective. And I also wanted to make a comment about that digital intake form. I actually have some experience with that more recently when I took my niece and nephew go-karting. And at the front desk, the first step was, please self-register on this kiosk.
Yeah.
And one of these examples, like you mentioned, where I'm able to prevent data entry errors. So I make sure that my email address, my name is correct or not, because maybe I don't want to give them my email address.
Exactly.
In that context. But at least the idea of collecting more information, and then the idea of auto-subscribing them to a course or to a newsletter, I mean, that to me makes total sense. And I imagine that probably that kind of intake form will probably grow as time goes on.
I think so, and I hope so, because it's a model that makes sense, right? It's It's also something that kind of resonates with people's expectations of digital types of services. As soon as I subscribe to something, I want to use it immediately. And that's not going to be different when they're accessing a social service necessarily, where, okay, I've done the intake, I've given you my information, now get me started, right? And so there's a lot of really low-hanging fruit that, that people can be kind of subscribed to. So they feel like they're receiving service immediately, even before they interact with the person through that organization. And so I think that, there's a combination there again of once again, of understanding the person accessing your service and what their digital expectations might be. And either you have to manage those up front or you have to provide for them, right? So it's either letting them know, okay, this will take 24 to 48 hours, it'll be reviewed and then you'll be into the system, or poof, throw them into the system right away and give them something to start using that they find useful.
I imagine the UX of these types of forms are very important as well. You have to consider age. Maybe some people who are not very tech savvy might not be used to a touch screen, as much as you and I might be. Accessibility, visibility, color, color blindness. So I imagine that whoever creates these forms have to take all of this in consideration that they didn't have to worry about in the past.
For sure. And language can be, that's the thing about technologies. You can have multilingual forms, much more, perhaps more easily, and giving people those options. And what's interesting, for example, is that some of these agencies, you have to be nimble based on your client groups. So I've heard, for example, that at Access, the influx of Afghans and Ukrainians, there were certain digital literacy and language preferences and challenges. So they actually are doing more in-person intake now. Now, the person who's doing the intake is still sitting at that computer and doing it, but it's human facilitated. So there's always that notion of understanding your clients. And when the technology is a barrier, how do you shift away from it so that the person doesn't feel dissuaded to access your service, right? They still want to come and get help, but maybe that screen is a barrier. And that's always going to be the case, I think, for a certain percentage of the population, either by choice or simply by challenge. But I think because it was two large populations that they started to see this trend in, they modified their approach. They were flexible, and that there's something that's constantly going to be part of that moving forward, the flexibility of our models, the flexibility of how we use technology. And that is both really important, but it also can be, just like changing from Skype to Zoom, a challenge for frontline workers and for organizations to know, well, when do we offer flexibility? When do we be more nimble, for example, in our approach?
So I imagine that because some of these agencies are playing some kind of catch up, that they probably skip certain technologies in the interim, like, a certain period of time, people were using various other kinds of communication channels like ICQ. I don't know if people know that one, but that's an older one, earlier version of WhatsApp, let's call it. They were able to skip certain interim processes and interim technologies and be able to get to the more modern stuff. Like a really simple and easy example would be, I'm currently in Europe, and in Poland, for example, their mobile infrastructure is significantly better than Canada and the US because they didn't really build telephone lines, or hardwired telephone lines. They kind of skipped that step and went straight to mobile. So mobile is very cheap, it's accessible, it's very quick. So I imagine in the same kind of context, or maybe you can tell me, some of these immigration type of agencies were able to benefit from jumping straight to the shiny new toy that works better than the technologies they had to work with in the past.
I think so. I think, and there's a dual edge to that. I think part of with people coming from source countries like Poland, and again, most countries around the world, I think mobile is more accessible and cheaper than in Canada. So there's a bit of a sticker shock when they get here and they see how much it costs and how little you get sometimes in terms of data and stuff from a mobile contract. But they still do it because it's so valuable and it's what they've become used to. On the other side, absolutely, the pitch for technology has become, I think, in a lot of ways easier. And I think it's why people were able to, during the pandemic, pivot so quickly to technology, because it's evolved in, for all of its issues with user experience and interfaces and stuff, it is miles ahead of where it was, say, 10 years ago, right? When you would go into an office and talk about how do you get set up on Skype, or how do you get set up on, ICQ or whatever the technology of the day might have been, it's so much easier now because, it's an app on your phone and it's sort of, it's a easy to use interface on your computer. And so once you help people understand the value of using that tool, the tools themselves have become a lot, I would say, sort of more simplified, more intuitive in some ways. As long as you start to understand what those, the little hamburger or the three dots things are, right? There's certain weird navigational things that we've kind of you have to get used to and you have to understand. I always use my parents as an example of when something isn't intuitive at all. It's because we didn't grow up with the sandwich navigation and the three dots. That's where you'll find your settings and those kinds of things. So there's still assumptions that are made in technology, but for sure, talking to someone who is using also this technology in their personal life, perhaps more deeply than they would have in the past. ICQ is a great example. It was kind of like the online text chat of the geek world. Not everybody necessarily used it, but then AOL came along, had AOL rooms and chat and stuff. And now, we've got digital messaging apps, which everybody is using in some way, depending on the community they're in. They're just using a different one, whether it's Telegram, WhatsApp, texting itself, WeChat, Viber, vContact, Facebook Messenger. I mean, the list goes on, right? So it's the usability and the fact that they're using it makes it a lot easier to have the conversation. You just have to shift it into, okay, well, how do you use these tools in a professional context, in a secure context, in a service-related context, which is really less about the technology and more about the soft side of things, and how you communicate differently using those tools than you might with a family member. But the tools themselves are typically already quite familiar for people.
In comparing mobile data plans, which is I think a crazy comparison to Canada, I pay $10 for 100 gigabytes a month versus in Canada, I think I'm paying $55 for like 20 gigs. I mean, it's such a wide difference. And it's amazing to see people here use WhatsApp. Like they don't use SMS or text messages at all. It's all about WhatsApp. I guess that's why Facebook bought them. But
yeah, exactly.
And it's one of the tools you mentioned in the pre-arrival as well. What I didn't hear you mention, though, in terms of those tools, any kind of social media, does that come into play?
It does, yeah. Again, from a service perspective, I tend to talk about like the digital messaging and video and stuff like that. Social media like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And I guess in the background, a lot of those have messaging that people use. They may not use Instagram. I mean, I know that in some youth populations, I've seen some research on, they're using Instagram in very hidden ways, but they use it as a messaging tool amongst themselves. So social media has a place, but it's also about in a lot of cases, social media in the settlement and immigration is more of the broadcast and outreach and marketing tool rather than the service tool. And in part, that's because they're not really secure messaging tools, right? So the moment you start having a more private interaction or trying to do an intake with somebody, you need to be able to shift to a secure tool. And even right now, forget the metadata stuff with Facebook, but WhatsApp is an encrypted tool, so you can use WhatsApp to actually have an exchange, or you can use Signal or another messaging app, or even iMessage to iMessage, right? And you can have actual encrypted, secure conversations with people. So I like to kind of talk about social media as a gateway technology, but for a client interaction, you want to eventually move people over to more secure channels, for example. It's kind of like you can have the conversation at the front desk in your organization in the waiting room, but as soon as that person starts talking about private stuff, you want to move them into an office where you can close the door and have a private conversation. So social media is where organizations can get the word out, share interesting work that they're doing, have high-level interactions with potential clients to provide information and some referral back into their organization or to other organizations. But then you want to have in place a strategy of, okay, well, if this is starting to become a conversation or an intake, we got to shift it over to a different technology or an in-person experience or something like that. So a lot of organizations, though, this is part of the problem with technology. Without thinking about audiences, sometimes a lot of people, especially a few years ago, were, if you went to any settlement organization's website, you'd probably see a Twitter icon, a Facebook icon, a LinkedIn icon, and then maybe like an Instagram icon or something like that. And part of that was kind of like, oh, everybody's on Facebook, so we have to be on Facebook. Everybody's on Twitter, so we have to be on Twitter. And there weren't a lot of strategic reasons necessarily why people would go there. And certainly, from the perspective of serving newcomers, those channels aren't necessarily the place. Other service providers, other immigration lawyers, other people in the sector might be using some of them. But in a lot of cases, people started to say, well, putting efforts into these social media technologies, but we're not really getting a lot of return. And because the question wasn't, did they go and ask clients, are you on Twitter? Would you interact with us on Twitter? Is Twitter a place where you go and look for information? They were more just doing it because, the mad gold rush, everybody else was going onto social media. So I see those as you have to always be strategic in them. Like Facebook's a good example where your Facebook page is less important than probably what happens in the background with Messenger, where people are asking you questions and doing direct messaging and things like that. So the strategy for Facebook is, you've got to share, and you might even need to do some ad buys in order to become visible. But the interactions you have, are less focused on the likes and the reshares and the commenting, and more on, are people actually using that information to come and access services for you?
And that makes total sense. It's easy to drink the Kool-Aid, or it's easy to succumb to social pressure and saying, oh, it's what everybody's doing, so it must be cool, we have to do it. But you're right, without a strategy, there's no point. It actually can diminish your reputation if you are not constantly giving useful tools or useful information on these platforms. To my listeners, my guest Marco had a quick audio issue. We're back. He's got a better microphone, so he sounds even better. So we'll just pick up and just keep going. I'm curious to know, you mentioned CRM at one point, and of course, my CRM is my wheelhouse, the thing I love talking about the most. So I'm curious to know, how does a CRM play with all this interaction? Like, what is it used for? What typical CRMs do you normally see with settlement organizations?
Yeah, I mean, CRMs are still relatively in their infancy in our sector, I would say. We're talking about moving a sector from paper-based to Excel spreadsheets to a reporting approach. For example, there are some client tracking systems that their purpose is really just to report to the funder the information that the funder needs. So they're built and simplified for that process. And then you've got organizations, and again, Access Employment is another good example, that have invested. They've invested in specifically in Salesforce, but certainly I think it's Microsoft Azure. I'm not sure what their platform is, but it's basically for the big ones, it's Microsoft, it's Salesforce, where they're not just using it for client reporting, right, for output, but they're really using it for client journey tracking, for intelligence gathering, to find out, okay, what can we truly understand? It goes back to that whole idea of understanding the newcomer and their needs individually, but also in the aggregate, right? So, the CRM that's used adequately can help see we're seeing a lot of people from this background, from this country. Maybe we need to do some workshops or create some resources to support them differently. You can do, let's say, a postal code analysis, and all of a sudden you realize a lot of people are coming from this part of town. Should we go out and meet them in that part of town and start doing on-site kinds of services and support? And we're not seeing a lot of people from this part of town, but if we overlay that with demographic data that we can get from the city or from Statistics Canada, we can see that part of the town actually has a huge population of newcomers. So why aren't we reaching them, kind of thing? So you see some organizations using them in quite sort of sophisticated ways, but I would say that those are very few. But it's emerging because, and again, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's been spurred on by the pandemic as well, around using data as a tool and data as an important way to do planning, so that we really use data to make decisions, or to help make decisions, rather than just anecdotes and the idea of instinct, for example. So especially when organizations are serving large groups of clients, you can only generate so much instinct and anecdote from those. The data tells a different story. So there's a number of projects that are happening in the sector that look at, okay, what do we need to be tracking, and not just for reporting to funders, but for our purposes as organizations, but also our purpose as community oriented or community anchored organizations. What can we understand about the community that can help us advocate on their behalf, build projects? And then the other side of that is, all these organizations do significant referral into the community. And the typical story is I refer someone to an organization, they go and they do a new intake, they have to retell their story, and 80% of that information is the same information that they gave to me before I made the referral. And there's maybe 20% that's unique to the organization that I've referred them to, but they have to go through that whole new intake. So how can we build on the interoperability of technology so that I can shift the data with the client, with their permission, with their consent, all of the sort of, cybersecurity, privacy kind of caveats in place, so that that data goes with them to that organization, and they have a system that can import that data so that they can review it, but they don't have to ask all of those questions again. They just have to ask that extra 20% that is relevant to the service that they're going to provide to that person. And that is very, very, we know we know all of these things are possible, but they're extremely in their infancy, because for a number of reasons. One is we don't have that kind of data portability process. A lot of organizations, we don't have common intake forms and sort of standards. At the end of the day, you could probably look at every intake form and say 50% is the same stuff that every agency asks, but then it sort of starts to go off the rails in some ways. So, can we have common standards, or what are the APIs that can help interact between, whether it's Salesforce to Salesforce or Salesforce to custom build or something like that, so that that data can follow the client, and that together perhaps we can also use all of that data from across these referrals to generate some of that sort of information, those insights, that intelligence about clients. So we kind of know what's possible, and we've learned more about what's possible over the last couple of years, but we're very much in our infancy when it comes to that in our sector. So there's a huge both learning curve, but also opportunity curve for that.
Do some of these agencies need to report to a higher authority, like to government agencies and so forth, or are these already government agencies? Forgive me for the ignorance, but I'm curious to know,
No, that's okay.
How does that information, because we talked about privacy, security, I'm curious to know, how beyond the organization that's collecting the data, who else normally needs to see it?
So in the case that I'm talking about government-funded organizations or organizations that get grants. And so they are reporting to their funder. And sometimes it's multiple funders. That's the other thing as well, right? So there's federal funders, there's provincial, there's municipal, there's private philanthropic organizations as well. And so there's different kinds of reporting that they're doing to all. In the case of the federal funding, so the biggest funder of immigrant settlement organizations is IRCC, Immigrant Refugee Citizenship Canada. And you're literally, getting someone's PR card number, which is their unique identifier, and that goes up to IRCC so that they can track that person as well for their data about where is this person accessing services and what types of services and things like that. So there's a lot of that kind of reporting that happens. And that's, again, more output reporting. So this person came, they accessed these services, they come from these backgrounds, here are their demographics. And we're like many service sectors, we're moving towards outcomes-based evaluation and reporting, so that we're looking not just at this person came, they put their bum in a seat and they took this resume workshop, but did they get a useful job out of it? What was the outcome of the service interaction? And so in a lot of ways, that's why I think a lot of organizations are trying to harness CRMs and that kind of technology, is to try to really gain that information, to see that client journey and where they end up, rather than just as a reporting tool to their funders.
And then combining technology with process. I know we spoke a bit before about this babycenter.com approach. If you could speak a bit about, the benefiting, or the using rather, of technology and tools to guide an immigrant coming to, let's say, Canada, from start to finish.
Yeah, so the babycenter.com approach, babycenter.com is a website where you can go, and it's an app as well, where you can go and you can, a woman can put in their expected due date, and then they start getting emails or messages once a week saying, okay, you're in your 34th week. This is probably how you're feeling. You should be thinking about X, Y, and Z. Here are things you should be preparing, questions to ask your doctor or midwife. And then once the baby is delivered, you rejig the date, and it starts as the birth date. And then you start getting weekly messages based on the child and child development. So week one, you're probably freaking out. You just brought your child home from the hospital, or your child is 1 week old. Here are some things to think about. And then 6 months later, here's developmental milestones you should be looking for. Here are questions that other parents are asking. Here's what our expert pediatricians think about. And we use that with our two sons, and I think it goes up to 5 years old, possibly even a bit longer. So like every week, and I used to laugh about the accuracy of them, right? You're 7 months in, you still don't have a handle on being a parent, and you're asking these questions. Oh, do I know what I'm doing? And then suddenly you get an email that says, you're probably wondering if you know what you're doing. It was incredible. Sometimes the how prescient they were.
That's a well-researched tool.
Very well researched. And so what's behind it is a website with articles that are written by health professionals and other parents, and then a discussion, a community section where parents are talking with each other. And some of the benefits of that were really interesting, is that you'd have people commenting saying, 80% of the advice in this article really worked for me, but here's the other 20%, here's how we figured it out with our kid. And then someone else would say, oh yeah, that reminds me of this. And all of a sudden you're getting kind of the professional with the personal, right? So you're getting both sides of the story, which is really useful. And so in a lot of ways, right, the idea there is that child development is somewhat linear. Of course, it's not 100% for every child, but there are certain, just like pregnancy, it's certain expectations, certain tests you'll take, certain visits to your healthcare professional, and similarly with a child. And so I started to think, well, we separate immigrant settlement into pre-arrival services and post-arrival services, but it's really just all about preparing for settlement kind of thing. So what could a babycenter.com approach look like for immigration? And it's okay, because you do an application process, and then at some point you get a letter or a message that says you have been accepted to come to Canada. And then you sort of set your date, your landing date, which might be a few weeks to a few months out. But so having a kind of an approach where you would put that into a site and say, okay, I'm landing on this day and I'm planning to live in Toronto. And so getting messages then leading up to that moment saying, here are the things you should be thinking about before you arrive. Here are the things you can do related to employment and health and education and housing, and all of the sort of topic areas and categories that cover immigration and settlement, which is literally everything you can think about when it comes to living. And then on the day they land, let's say they land on a different day. Once again, they rejig that date and they say, okay, now you're in Canada. Here are the things you should do in your first week. And there's guides out there, right? This is not new content or ideas, but there are literally things called first days guides or your first month in Canada or something like that. And again, all along the way, there's a lot of, so you might want to, you're thinking about enrolling your children in school. Okay, well, each province has their own education system, so you need to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for, I'm not sure how long, but for a certain period of time, getting that information to people about their settlement journey and where there are useful resources, but also connecting them to other newcomers so that they can have these conversations amongst each other. And there's a couple of things with these. None of this is new. It's just not amalgamated, right? There are tons of immigration portals out there where you can get this kind of information. So like I said earlier, I worked on settlement.org. It still exists. It's the post-arrival website for newcomers coming to Ontario. And the idea is if you have questions about settlement, there are answers there. So the content already exists. It would just need to be rejigged in a new format. Newcomer networks exist everywhere, both in person as well as online, and increasingly on these messaging apps like WhatsApp and WeChat and Facebook Messenger and things like that. And they're increasingly private. So it's a small group of newcomers speaking to each other. And the value of opening that up could be really interesting so that newcomers could support each other and say, well, that advice about getting a job is interesting, but let me tell you about what worked for me. 80% of that advice worked. And then here's the last 20% that helped me get a job, and not just any job, but a job in my field, in my, recognize my skill set and things like that. So the idea is that there's a certain linearity to settlement and immigration as well. There's also a huge issue with information and service gaps for newcomers. So all of the research over the last 20 years has told us that only about between 30 to 50% of newcomers access services before they arrive or when they arrive. But when you survey newcomers, more of them would access information and services if they knew about them. So there's a problem of knowing about them. A service like this, for example, could be the beginnings of it could be at the point that you get the approval as an immigrant, you're automatically enrolled into this service and you start getting messages. Now you can exit that, you can unsubscribe, but theoretically that starts to give information to people who may not have even thought of where they should go for information or that they need this information. It's that serendipity once again of, I don't know what I don't know about enrolling my child in school in Toronto. Could a tool like this help them at least get those initial starting points? And could we reach more people with information so that their settlement journey wouldn't be as frustrating? For example, they'd get their questions answered earlier. They'd get connected to information resources and service providers earlier if they needed them. But at the very least, they'd get a regular weekly kind of message that helps them on their journey, basically.
Love it. I think it's a fantastic approach and a fantastic use of the tool. I imagine there's multiple journeys based on whether you're coming alone or coming with a partner and children, recommendations and tools and places to investigate and explore and take advantage of in terms of services offered by the government and various other agencies.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential, and it also can help with some of the duplication. Like every agency, every service provider right now is writing an article about how to write a resume, how to find a job. And so you can look at this as a content amalgamation as well, where a lot of that kind of sort of generic information can be created and shared, and then the local organizations can focus more on the local context, right? It's kind of like that CRM thing where if 80% of the data goes with the person, well, okay, I can ask them the last 20% of the questions. Well, if how to find a job is basically the same process no matter where you land in Canada, okay, but I can tell you in Toronto, what are I can give you the last 20% of that information. So how do you find a job in Toronto based on those generic kind of approaches to job finding? Here's our labor market situation. Here are the big employers, things like that. And then in these agencies, instead of having to, write the same stuff, they could focus on they could localize that knowledge more.
So looking toward the future, then, where would you like to see some of these settlement organizations be in the next few years? Is it a journey that never ends, or is there a place in the future that you can visualize to say, all right, you guys are on the right track, you're the platinum standard or whatever, that you guys are in great hands, you don't need any further assistance? And if that does exist, what would that look like?
So it's definitely a journey that never ends, because I think what we've learned with technology is that it's always changing. But one of the things that I've been lucky enough to be part of is in some research and advocacy in the sector and for funders around sort of the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities related to digital transformation. And one of the things that we've talked about is creating baselines in infrastructure, baselines in competency, baselines in organizational and individual capacity, as well as baselines in investment or funding models and things like that. So that, what I would love to see is that, in a few years, no matter what organization is being funded, they have a digital inclusion approach. They have competencies in all areas like cybersecurity. So if you're going to access online services with them, it's secure, it's encrypted when it needs to be. Every frontline worker has the same kind of set of data literacy and data capabilities. Managers understand how to manage hybrid and digital environments. There's ongoing knowledge sharing and mobilization through the sector so that people are sharing what's working, new models, new innovations that others might be able to replicate or at least learn from, and adequate and realistic and flexible funding models. And I say adequate because technology is not something you can invest in just once, right? It's there's some big investments initially, but it has to be maintained, and your things are evolving, new tools are coming out and things like that. So there's certainly a lot of work that still needs to be done, and I think it'll never end, right? 7 years ago, our sector wasn't using WhatsApp. It took a Syrian refugee influx. 2 years ago, many people had never heard of Zoom before. Now it's an indispensable tool in our work. That'll continue to change and evolve over time, and so we need to be able to be responsive to those changes, especially as they relate to what newcomers are using. So that whole sort of data literacy as well around understanding our communities and newcomers, not just around technology, but also just in terms of their preferences and their needs, is something that just never ends. It's something we have to build in and bake in and make it part of our baseline approaches.
It makes sense. Marco, this has been great. Where can people find more about you online and perhaps get in touch if they have any follow-up questions?
Sure. So my consulting website is marcopolis.org. So that's marcopolis.org. And I have a website called Knowledge Mobilization for Settlement, which is KM and then the number 4s.ca, where I try to share what I'm learning and finding. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my network of choice, where I'm having really interesting conversations with people all the time when it comes to these topics.
That's awesome. And we'll have those links in the show notes below. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a fun conversation. I hope it's useful to someone out there.
Yeah, please. And let us know if listeners have learned something. If they have any feedback, it'd be great to hear from you, either to myself or to Marco.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. That's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.